Introduction. For years, Mein Kampf stood as proof of the blindness and complacency of the world. For in its pages, Hitler announced, long before he came to power, a program of blood and terror in a self-revelation of such overwhelming frankness that few among its readers had the courage to believe it. Once again, it was demonstrated that there was no more effective method of concealment than the broadest publicity. Mein Kampf was written in white hot hatred, but this hatred was aimed not at the author's enemies, but at his supposed friends. The book is an oratorical denunciation of collaborators who largely shared the political aim of the author, but refused to accept his methods. As the discussion goes on, the tone of the debate grows louder and more impassioned, for to Hitler the only principle which really counts is his claim to supreme leadership, and when this claim is disputed by people whom in his loveless soul he secretly despises, he is driven half mad with hatred. It was in 1922 that Hitler first planned a small pamphlet, the title of which was to be In Abrechnung, or Settling Accounts. He wanted to prove that the leaders of German right-wing parties were wrong in their methods, lacked strength, imagination, and political judgment, and were bound to fail. He discussed the booklet at length with his close friends, Rudolf Hess and Dietrich Eckart. Eckart himself had compiled a little book from his talks with Hitler. Its title was Bolshevism from Moses to Lenin, and it attempted to prove that Judaism was the great destructive force which had ruined Western civilization. The book was brutally written, and although he claimed to express Hitler's ideas, these were expounded in a way which was more Eckart's than Hitler's. Hitler must have realized its growing necessity of stating his own principles in his own language in a more definite, more authoritative form. He probably had an uneasy feeling that some of his followers, although admiring him as an orator, did not believe him to be a clear or profound thinker. People whom he himself regarded as his inferiors endeavored to outline what they called the fundamental principles of his own party, and quarreled about these principles over the head of their leader. Gottfried Freder, who had collaborated in drafting the party's program and who considered himself the mastermind of the whole movement, wrote a booklet about the aims of Nazism. In it, he insisted strongly on his own particular ideas and laid stress can't speak right now, economic principles that were distinctly socialistic, such as an abomination of capital interests. At the same time, Alfred Rosenberg, Hitler's mentor, published an equally authentic comment on the party aims differing sharply from Freder's. Rosenberg insisted on certain racial and sociological aspects of the issue, such as the inequality of men and the superiority of the Nordic or Aryan type. True, Freder and Rosenberg had one thing in common: both attacked the Jews, but their points of view were entirely different. To Freder, the Jews were profiteers in a vicious economic system. To Rosenberg, they were the creators of the modern world, the standard bearers of the 20th century, and of all that he and his fellows hated: freedom of speech and press, egalitarian justice, representative government, free access of every citizen to all professions and public services without discrimination of birth, wealth, or religion. The decisive factor in human society was, to Rosenberg, the outstanding personality, the great lone wolf, the creative Superman. This idea was not new, but it well fitted Hitler's purpose, for at the time uh, democratic and dictatorial tendencies still struggle side by side in the Nazi movement, and men like Feder claimed to be Hitler's equals. To settle these disturbing quarrels between his followers, to strengthen his own authority as leader, the idea man of his movement, Hitler decided to broaden the scope of the projected book and to add the story of his life, brushing up to the heroic size, the picture of his inglorious youth, and picturing himself as one of whose boyhood had been marred by poverty, who had risen by his own strength and intelligence to be the leader of a great political party, thus making a symbol of humiliated but unconquerable German people and a victim of the same social forces which he was then attacking. Let me know in the comments below uh, if you have uh, known anyone who made themselves seem better than they really are. Okay, that looks so much better. Okay. But the main aim of his book was to show that he was the only founder and builder of the National Socialist movement. He never mentions the name of Captain Ernest Röhm, who contributed at least as much as himself to the rise of the party. He says little about Anton Drexler, the real founder of the movement. He makes no mention of Hermann Esser and gives no idea of the indispensable role played by Julius Streicher. His only reference to Gregor Strasser, his most powerful rival for the party leadership, is an obscure joke about his predilection for card playing. Strasser is never mentioned by name. After the unsuccessful putsch of November 1923, Hitler spent about 13 months in a so-called prison. There he wrote most of what later became the first volume of his famous book. He intended to call it a 4.5-year struggle against lies, stupidity, and cowardice, settling accounts with the destroyers of the National Socialist movement. His idea was to tell the inside story of his putsch and its collapse. But then he dropped this plan and the title lost its meaning. It seems that one of his associates, Max Amann, had the idea of simply calling the whole Mein Kampf My Struggle. The subtitle of the first volume remained Ein Arbeitung, settling accounts, although it no longer made sense. The first volume was dictated by the author to two men who were in prison with him. One was Emil Morrissey, a strong-armed man who not too well fitted for the job. Then came Rudolf Hess, who had escaped to Austria, returned, was arrested, and went to the same prison as his master. Together they finished the first volume. Hess had often been called a disciple of Karl Haushofer, the military geographer. No doubt Haushofer influenced some part of Mein Kampf, but it is misleading to represent him as Hitler's guiding genius. The essential parts of the book do not concern questions of foreign policy or military geography, but of race, Propaganda and Political Education. The first volume was published in the fall of 1925. It disappointed many readers who had expected a revelation of, or at least a dramatic story, not a philosophy ill-founded, undocumented, and badly written. Many readers indicated instantly, I should say, should not be taken too literally. It is true that Emmons claimed that at that time to have sold 23,000 copies during the first year, but this was very doubtful boast. The average party member did not read the book, and among the leaders, it was common saying that Hitler was an extraordinary speaker, a great leader, a political genius, but it's too bad he had to write that silly book. The second edition of the first volume and the second volume from the beginning was supervised by one Joseph Cranny. At the time, staff member of the Volkswagen Beobacher, the party paper, the text became somewhat more civilized. The difference between the first edition and the later ones is not as great as it often believed. The most important of the differences concerns the structure of the Nazi Party. When Hitler published the first edition of the first volume, the Nazi Party was still a democratic organization which elected officials. 2 years later, the leader principle or dictatorship within the party was firmly established. Hitler had reached the goal of which the whole book was written. The unalterable program of the party, the so-called 25 points, called for a central parliament as the highest authority of the future Nazi state. The first edition of Mein Kampf had to accept these principles. The second edition changed all that. From now on, the party aim was definitely set toward dictatorship. The second volume came out in December 1926 and was read by even fewer people than the first, certainly by none outside of the still small Nazi Socialist Party. For some years to come, the book remained a financial burden on the shoulders of Max Ehrmann, Hitler's business manager. Ehrmann had been appointed in 1925 manager of the Franz Herr Verlag, the party's publishing house virtually owned by Hitler, and to this day he has remained at the head of the sources of Hitler's private fortune. He knew that Hitler needed financial resources in order to control the party effectively. He saw it more clearly than Hitler himself, who had no sense for business. Ehrmann hoped that the book would become a source of private revenue. 2 or 3 years before Hitler came into power, the sales of Mein Kampf began to rise, and later they rose astronomically. Ehrmann went on printing the book from the same poor type on the same cheap paper as before. Everybody was forced to buy it. It was presented as a gift to newly-wed couples, but the license fee was doubled. Mein Kampf made Hitler rich. It became a bestseller second only to the Bible. The book may well be called a kind of satanic Bible to the author, although he was shrewd enough not to state it explicitly himself, but to have it said by his spiritual advisor, Alfred Rosenberg. The belief in human equality is a kind of hypnotic spell exercised by world-conquering Judaism with the help of the Christian churches. Later, the Jews invented the mass seduction of little democracy and the last stage Marxism, which was their tool. By preaching the principle of human equality, Judaism has attempted to extirpate the feeling of pride from the soul of the Aryan race, to rob them of their leadership, to give back to the noble races their former consequences of superiority by incalculating the principle that men are not equal in the theatrical purpose of Mein Kampf. Compared to the spirit of the book, the paragrammatical parts are of less importance. Nevertheless, they have aroused more interest, for they are easier to understand. Foreign policies, blueprints for world conquest, presumptions for alliance or wars. Most readers flung themselves upon these passages after the author had become a leading actor on the world stage, but a little reflection would show that in the pathless field of politics, you cannot follow a schedule. When Hitler set down his plans for a future foreign policy, he was a mere shimmer. Adolf Hitler, the author of Mein Kampf, was not yet Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Germany. He lacked the experience, the responsibilities, the knowledge. In fact, he was nothing more than an organizer of street fights in a precedent area of mass meetings, the leader of a virtually non-existent party who gambled with rival leaders of similar unimportance. The soundest appraisal of these utterances on foreign policy were made by Adolf Hitler himself in the course of a liberal suit in Munich, to a fat and bored judge who staring through gold-rimmed spectacles, meditated whether to fine both parties 500 or 1,000 marks. Adolf Hitler explained, in political life, there is no such thing as principles of foreign policy. The pragmatic principles of my party are its doctrine on the racial problem and its fight against pacifism and internationalism. But foreign policy in itself is merely means to an end. In question of foreign policy, I shall never admit that I am tied by anything. Nevertheless, Mein Kampf is packed with principles of foreign policy, all of which have been taken more seriously by others than the author himself. What gives Mein Kampf its terrific importance is not the aims, but the methods. Whether Hitler proclaims war against Russia or friendship with Britain, a crusade against the United States or a plot with Japan, a conquest by land or by sea, revolt against the rich or the poor, all these plans and schemes mean nothing. He has changed them again and again because in questions of foreign policy I shall never admit that I am tied by anything. But the fact that all of his schemes, even his friendship, mean bloodshed, an alliance which does not imply that intention of going to war would be meaningless. That is what gives this foreign policy its sinister significance. Whether he speaks of art or of education, of economics, he always sees blood. He does not like a certain kind of artist or educator, and that will be reason enough to kill him. We shall do away with them radically. This is his typical slogan. The light-hearted with which he threatens murder at the slightest provocation is perhaps even more frightful than the threats themselves. And that such a man could go so far toward realizing his ambitions, and above all, could find millions of willing tools and helpers. That is a phenomenon the world will ponder for centuries to come. It's from Conrad Hedin. Oh man, just everything we're going to expect from the book. Goodness gracious. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are to be expected.